So we were talking about how God has created the world, how he put us in charge of it, how it was fallen and corrupted, how it will be redeemed, how it helps us understand and worship him, praise him. And yet when we look at the study of creation through science, there are some things that could be painful and irritating and damaging. So how can we deal when we have what is said to us about the origins of the earth and so on, based on a presupposition of scientific naturalism, and it just isn't seeming good? How can we react? For example, the word evolution is often used to support naturalism, and it really makes us want to do a knee-jerk and get really defensive, and your side and my side, and let's argue. Let's remember to go back to the basic principle of wisdom from above is pure and peaceable, ready to be entreated, humble, and willing to look again. So let's look at this word. It's a word that's often used for two very different mechanisms, and this is confusing because one of them is easily demonstrable. The other one is not. And the two ideas are mixed together in a way that can be quite confusing. Let's look. Let's just go back and look at Genesis 1. God said, "Let the water teem with living creatures. Let the birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the sky." So God created the great creatures of the sea and every living and moving thing with which the water teems, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. It was beautiful. And God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and increase in number and fill the water in the seas. Let the birds increase on the earth." And there was evening and there was morning of the fifth day. And God said, "Let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, livestock, creatures that move along the ground, wild animals, each according to its kind." And it was so. And God made their kinds and all the creatures that move along the ground. And God saw what he had made was good. So it's clear, here's God creating according to kinds. And yet people talk about evolution, that can build anything. Sometimes they use it that way. But one of the definitions of evolution, when you read scientific textbooks, is selection for information present in the gene pool. In a population, you can select for tall dogs and short dogs. You can select for white dogs and black dogs, and you have change over time. You have descent with modification. There's lots of evidence for this. And yet they'll still use the word evolution because it just means change. Of course, we're left with the question, is a species a biblical kind? We saw that they're created according to kinds. What is a kind and what is a species? We have to look at the words when we're making models of reality. I taught different courses in which we looked at species concepts. There's several species concepts. There's more than this. I have a whole book on species concepts. One is the morphological species concept, and this is the only thing that bird watchers can use. How big is it? What color is it? How does it sing? What's its shape? That's what morph means. And you sort like with like. You have the biological species concept. In other words, do these different things breed together in the wild? And you have the phylogenetic species concept, which is separated or separating gene pools. So here you have tanagers, and you have two different species of tanagers, the summer tanager and the scarlet tanager. But where they interact, you will have some interbreeding going on. That by all these species concepts, these are two species. Are they more than one kind? Here you have red and yellow shafted flickers. Is this one or two species? And you talk about, when you do taxonomy or naming the animals, you talk about lumpers and splitters, ones who are going to put all the brown bears in the world into one species, or ones that want to have lots of separate types of brown bears, like the Kodiak bears and the grizzly bears and the European brown bears and so on. And here you have the flickers, and they intergrade and interbreed, but they that would be, at the integration, they would be one species by the biological species concept, but because they look different, they're two by morphological and two by the phylogenetic species concept, because it looks like they're becoming more different. How about biblical kinds? Here you have an ecotype, a variation in the way that white-tailed deer look across North America. And here it's a continuous variation. So again, you have some who would say the little deer down in the south are actually a different species because they look quite different, or are they the same species? Here you have the wolf. In his gene pool, he has lots of information, and this is actually true for a lot of different animals. They have, when death was braided in, you're going to have extra babies and some that are going to be able to survive in all different environments, and that kind of information is there. So in the wolf genome, you can breed everything from a pug to a chow chow to an Afghan hound out of the same gene pool. And most would say these are all domestic dogs from the wolf gene pool. And yet you can see that there probably is morphological barriers to breeding between some of the different sizes of dogs. It would take a very enthusiastic little Chihuahua male to breed the female Great Dane. And when they do things like the miniature doodles, they use artificial insemination. And yet they're quite able to have babies. It's hard to know exactly where the borders are because you get some hybridization going on. Here you have a zebra and a horse. Here you have a lion and a tiger. There are things that make you wonder exactly where the edges are, but we can go back and look and see which are actually different kinds and which are not. We can look at it that way. But in nature, there are a pattern in fossil record and in what we see that we can clearly say this kind and this kind and this kind. That pattern is clear. Here's ring species. This is a little salamander, and this one can breed with this one, breed with this one. This is around California, and so on back around. But by each species concept, these are different subspecies, and some would be splitters, or looking at the phylogenetic and say there are many different species instead of just subspecies. Here's adaptive radiation, and this is one of the things that Darwin saw, was Darwin's finches on the Galapagos Islands. He noticed that it looked like the finches were getting more different from each other as they adapted to local conditions. And you can see they have different types of beaks, and they specialized on different foods. And so if you get very good at eating a certain thing, you're going to have more babies than somebody who isn't particularly good at eating anything. And many of these interbreed on wet years, but on dry years, again, the populations are more different than each other. Again, you ask, where are the borders? And I don't have a model for exactly where are the borders, but it's a question I think is worthwhile asking. This is, of course, defined as evolution, the selection for information present in a gene pool. In neo-Darwinism, this new information is said to come from random errors or mutation. This isn't strongly supported by observation, to such an extent that in many textbooks now, they don't talk about new things arising from mutation. They talk about the different tools or genes being used in very different contexts, and we'll look a little more about that later. Mutation is basically broken protein machines. Here you have the melanin in our eyes and hair, and in the horse's eyes and hair, is made by a cascade of protein machines. You got to remember, a gene makes a protein. A protein is basically a little nanomachine that does work. And one of the little nanomachines that does work to put the dark pigment in the skin of us and horses is broken in albinism. And so you have here this little African child who isn't able to be black, and this horse who is not able to be whatever color it would have been, because it doesn't have that working protein machine. It's broken. Here you have one of the protein machines that helps the long bones grow in achondroplastic dwarfism, and we've bred for that in corgis and some of the other short-legged dog breeds, but we also see it in humans. If a protein machine is broken, it doesn't work, and that's a mutation. There's limits to what can be done by mutation. Some mutations, for example, sickle cell anemia, in which one of the proteins that carries oxygen in the red blood cells is broken, protects against malaria, because a malaria parasite can get into the red blood cell and hide from the immune system. But if it stresses the red blood cell and the protein that should have carried the oxygen goes poing and straightens out, it could poke a hole in that little parasite. So if all of your proteins aren't broken and you just carry that, sometimes you'll cure the malaria parasites. So sickle cell anemia, or carrying the information for a broken hemoglobin protein, is common in areas where malaria is very common, because those who are carrying the bad gene are somewhat protected from malaria. If you have 2 bad copies, then you're going to be sick. And Behe's central assertion regarding Darwinian evolution is that it exists, but it's better at disturbing existing metabolic pathways, like the metabolic pathway for melanin that we saw, or the metabolic pathway that makes working hemoglobin, than making new ones, and therefore plays only a limited role in the development and diversification of life on Earth. So you can maybe do some things, like make a white horse or have someone be a little resistant to malaria, but you're not going to make a whole new kind of thing by mutation. Darwin understood that there had to be information present, and it had to be able to be done gradually. He didn't know about genetics, but he said this: if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. This is the concept of irreducible complexity. Michael Behe wrote a book called Darwin's Black Box, and he said if Darwin had known how complex a cell actually is, he wouldn't have thought that you could get all the way from one type of species to another. If you look at a mouse trap, in order for the trap to work, you have to have the little platform, you have to have the spring, you have to have the trap that flips open, you have to have the trigger. They all have to be there and working at the same time. The chances that all those things would accidentally end up being there and working at the same time simultaneously by accident are very small, and that's called irreducible complexity. And if you actually look in nature, you find incredibly complex things that are beautiful. And this is a quote from a relatively recent paper, a 2013 paper, on little rotary motors that work in cells. Harvard and some of the other big universities have wonderful animations about the proteins that are working in your cell. If you get a chance, it's great to look at them, but this just is one of them. And it's basically saying that these little rotary motors basically are the same thing, or very similar to human-made rotary motors. And here's a model of them. And here you can see, here's a hydroelectric generator, and it's got a lot of the same parts. They've color-coded them so the right parts are similar, as different types of ATP synthase. And you can easily see that a hydroelectric generator wouldn't happen just by shaking bits together for years and years. It doesn't accidentally fall together, so all the pieces would be there working together at the same time. The stuff that happened partway along would have to be really functional too, and we just don't see that. This is a complex thing that's there in the bacterial cells as well, and the eukaryotic cells. That means in bacteria, which are supposed to be primitive, and in eukaryotic cells, which is like our cells. So to me, it doesn't seem like random chance is the most simple or parsimonious explanation. If you see something that clearly was designed, there was probably a designer, it seems to me. Here's another, this is a bacterial flagellum, and it works as a rotary motor as well. And you can see, in order to work, every one of these different types of proteins had to be there together working exactly well. And if any of you have ever worked on motors, you know that if one thing isn't working, the whole thing doesn't work. So you can't have a half functional bit. The whole thing won't work.